gave an interview to the Ken Coleman radio show on June 16, 2012, and another on July 2nd to the Biblical Recorder newspaper, which is published weekly for and about Baptists in North Carolina. Dan's comments in support of traditional Christian teachings that marriage is between one man and one woman were blunt but not unusual or outrageous. He said, quote, "We're very much supportive of the family, the biblical definition of the family unit. We're a family-owned business, a family-led business, and we're married to our first wives. We give God thanks for that. We want to do anything possible that we can to strengthen families. We're very much committed to that." End quote. Kathy continued, "We intend to stay the course. We know it might not be popular with everyone, but thank the Lord we live in a country where we can share our values and operate on biblical principles." Wow. That was really outrageous of him. I mean, the very idea that someone would publicly spout the view that a family has value to our society. Dan even had the audacity to talk of a family that included a father, mother, and children all living in the same household, and husbands and wives who married and stayed that way. Scandalous. And that's when the chicken hit the fan. By the time Truett was in New York for my show, the controversy over Dan's remarks had fired up the same-sex marriage advocates. Even big city mayors like Rahm Emanuel of Chicago and the late Thomas Menino of Boston, who publicly vowed to run the Chick-fil-A businesses out of their towns because they disagreed with personal comments made by an executive of the company. There would have been less controversy had Dan Cathy slaughtered live chickens on the steps of Chicago City Hall at lunch hour. But what we witnessed instead was the slaughter of the basic American principles of freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and free enterprise. I was shocked that elected officials in America actually believed they could goose step on top of the Constitution and use the power of government to squelch a viewpoint that they didn't personally like, but one that incidentally was consistent with the will of the electorate in 34 states that had voted on the issue of same-sex marriage. It was especially hypocritical in Emanuel's case in that same-sex marriage was illegal at the time in his own state. But facts in the First Amendment didn't seem to get in the way of the bigotry and intolerance directed toward Dan Cathy. In fact, the viewpoint expressed by Dan Cathy was the very position held by none other than candidate Barack Obama in 2008. At California's Saddleback Forum in August 2008, when Pastor Rick Warren asked Obama's position on same-sex marriage, the then candidate expressly said he was opposed to it because, as a Christian, he found it not in keeping with his biblical view of marriage. After he was elected president, Barack Obama not only changed his view, but went on to become the cheerleader-in-chief for all things gay. One might even say that his opinion was fundamentally transformed. Who knew that the change in hope and change would actually come to describe Obama's own views? It's a reflection of how sloppy and biased journalism has become that I can't find any evidence of any reporter asking the simple question, "Mr. President, if your reason for opposing same-sex marriage in 2008 was because of your Christian belief that the biblical definition of marriage meant one man and one woman, has there been an update or revision to the Bible since then? Or did you base your decision to change your position on political expediency? And if so, were you being dishonest in 2008 or now?" Well, I'm still waiting on that one. Well, Truett had been scheduled to speak about his book, not the controversy over his son's remarks, and I wanted to be faithful to that purpose. Besides, it really wasn't his controversy, and it was obvious that the book's publicist, who was with him that day, was really nervous that the interview would ignore the book and focus on same-sex marriage. But it's never been my practice to ambush guests on my show. I was raised in the old-fashioned traditions of the South. A guest is to be treated with gracious hospitality. The role of a host is to meet the needs of the guest, not to use that guest to serve one's own interest. The host offers food, beverage, and the most comfortable chair in the house. Now, when I was growing up, even poor people in the South would dig up something for their guests in the way of refreshments, but criticism and confrontation, that was never on the menu. If a host had unkind words to say, they'd be held until after the guest had gone. Then the first thing said would be, "Bless his heart." Of course, that signaled that someone was about to get filleted like a cheap fish. But while the guest was present, you treated him or her with great kindness and deference. I always assume that's the way it ought to be on TV, just as it is in my